Good morning. It's Monday, November 25th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 416 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Terrible headlines out of the United Arab Emirates this weekend. The body of Rabbi Tzvi Kogan was found. He was murdered by Uzbek operatives reportedly recruited by the Iranian regime's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And in case it's not clear, the intent of this attack was to strike a blow at the UAE-Israeli normalization agreement signed back in 2020. The agreement held up rather well until now, even after all the pain and bloodshed of the last 13 plus months. But it may be time for the government in Abu Dhabi to consider expelling Iranian regime assets from the country. The Emirate of Dubai, in particular, is rife with regime assets, a few of the smaller emirates, too. If things shake out the right way, this episode and other developments on the horizon could push for a new regional order, one where the region finally steps up to the radical ideology of the truly odious regime in Iran. Today's guest is Jonathan Spire. He's the director of research for my old think tank, the Middle East Forum. Jonathan is an old friend. He's originally born in the UK, but has made Israel his home for decades. He fought in the 2006 Lebanon war, and he has a crazy story to recount about what he did afterwards. We'll talk to him about that and some breaking news in just a few minutes right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Fighting intensified this weekend between Israel and Hezbollah. 29 people were killed in Beirut on Saturday as the IDF targeted Mohammed Haidar, another senior Hezbollah commander. Hezbollah pummeled northern and central Israel with hundreds of rockets. To me, this was a sign that a Hezbollah-Israel ceasefire was close. Israel's government acknowledged as much this morning. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he agreed in principle to a deal. So why the uptick in violence? Whenever wars near their end, all parties want their public to know that they got their punches in before the guns went silent. The Israelis do this as much as Iran's proxies. Using the bizarre logic of the Middle East, it was good news because the fighting intensified. In Gaza, by contrast, I don't see an endgame. Hamas shows no sign of surrender, even though it has been roundly defeated. In the bizarro world of Hamas ideology, fighting to the bitter end is brave and honorable, with zero regard for the Gazans who want their nightmare over. If that's the case, Gaza is in for more misery. So are the Israeli hostage families. Let's hope that with a new administration in January, efforts to end the Gaza war will intensify. It's time for all the fighting to stop and all the hostages to come home. But remember, when the war ends, the Israelis will not forget what happened. The Iranian regime has yet to be held to account. The score has yet to be settled. The regime itself is now a target. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, a bipartisan group of House members called for a classified briefing on Turkey's ties to Hamas. Last week, an impressive bipartisan group of 40 Democrats and Republicans sent a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines requesting a briefing on reports that Hamas officials relocated from Qatar to Turkey. I'm curious to know how much our intelligence community has collected in Turkey over the years, but I'm pretty sure I'm not allowed to know that without a security clearance. These lawmakers are rightly concerned. Qatar recently kicked out the remaining Hamas leaders after they failed yet again to negotiate a hostage release. The relocation of the Hamas HQ to Turkey, which is a NATO ally, will only exacerbate longstanding concerns about Ankara's relationship with a wider range of terrorist groups and rogue states. Iran, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS are just a few of the bad guys that this rogue state counts as its friends. We're long overdue to hold Turkey to account. Will this letter and the briefing, should it happen, finally prompt action? I guess we'll find out soon enough. Headline 2, a gunman opened fire near the Israeli embassy in Jordan. According to Jordanian authorities, police officers pursued the gunman after shots rang out in Amman's Rabia district, which has been a flashpoint for anti-Israel demonstrations. Police reportedly chased the gunman for at least an hour before shooting him dead. The entire episode left 3 police officers wounded. The gunman's identity and motive are said to be unclear, but let me just say this. The Jordanian regime has, for the last year, engaged in anti-Israel rhetoric that is indistinguishable from that of Iran or Hamas. If this was yet another attempt to attack the Israeli embassy, the regime in Amman needs to do some serious soul searching. The Jordanian government's vitriol endangers the country's national security. The government in Amman should wake up to the fact this war may be coming to an end soon, and the Hashemites need Israeli gas, water, intelligence, and more for its survival. The path they're on is simply unsustainable. And headline 3, according to the left-leaning Israeli newspaper Haaretz, 2 advisors of Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu promoted the terror-sponsoring state of Qatar as both pragmatic and legitimate ahead of the World Cup in 2022. Yes, I'm aware Haaretz has it out for this government, and the government has it out for Haaretz. Over the weekend, the governing coalition voted to effectively blackball the Israeli newspaper of record. But that does not negate the veracity of this particular report. The Netanyahu government has much to explain as it pertains to the relationship it has sustained over the years with the terror-sponsoring Gulf Emirate. The facts are the facts. Bibi allowed Qatar to send as much as $30 million per month to Gaza for quite some time, purportedly as a way to sustain calm in the terror enclave of Gaza. We all know how that worked out, and the government has yet to explain itself. Again, leave Haaretz out of it. I still think it's time for a full accounting here, and I don't think I'm alone in that assessment. All right, it's now my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Spyer to the show. Jonathan is research director at a Philadelphia-based think tank where I once worked, the Middle East Forum. I can't tell you how many times he and I have swapped war stories over a beer or 3 during my visits to Israel. And believe me, Jonathan's always top mind. He's been to Iraq and Syria to cover the wars there, and has even fought one against Hezbollah back in 2006. So let's talk to Jonathan live right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Jonathan Spyer.
Thank you, John. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, great to have you. Let's start with an assessment of what's going on in Lebanon. Just this morning, it seems that we're on the verge of a ceasefire. Let's put it that way. Nothing's been signed, nothing's been agreed to, but we're definitely getting the sense that the Israeli government is ready, and so is the Lebanese government, such as it is. So is this a good thing? Are you feeling like this is where we should be right now in the region?
I have to say that I have my doubts as to whether this emergent ceasefire does constitute a positive outcome from an Israeli point of view. You know, what it looks like in terms of what we've currently been made aware of, at least, the 60-day period of implementation, withdrawal of IDF in full, 10,000 LAF, Lebanese armed forces south of the Litani, and the reinstitution of Resolution 1701, in effect, sounds like more of the same to me. That is to say, in essence, a restoration of the status quo ante bellum, the October 6th or 7th, so to speak, situation in the north. And that, to me, is not particularly a positive outcome. Hezbollah has been pummeled. Its leadership is gone. There have been tremendous achievements in the fields of intelligence and air power. The ground maneuver force, 3 divisions inside South Lebanon, has performed impressively and effectively. But if the sum total of the ground maneuver is that we have an essential restoration of the status quo ante bellum, then it does seem to me that what that implies is we can set the clock once again to slowly tick along until the next round, because the notion that the Lebanese armed forces are going to be the effective instrument for disarming Hezbollah south of the Litani is not only an illusion, it's a theory that's already been tested in the pre-October 2023 time and found to be without foundation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big question is this side letter that the Israeli government has purportedly received from the United States, that the Israelis have full freedom of action, that there will be full cover for the Israelis if and when they need to go back into southern Lebanon to clear Hezbollah out. What are you hearing about that letter? Is there anything more to it than what I've just explained?
No, you're absolutely right. The letter and whatever it will exactly consist of is the key difference between the status quo ante bellum and what we now may be looking to be experiencing. It will depend on political will in that case with regard to the government of Israel. But certainly what I'm hearing from local leaders in the north of Israel, is that this is not currently going to be sufficient for them to encourage their residents to return home. And of course, between 60, 70,000 of Israelis still outside of their homes. So my sense is that right now, at least, it doesn't look like that's going to be convincing enough to solve the key problem of a massive internally displaced Israeli population that's been the result of the events of the last year. But time will tell. Yeah, it all depends on the implementation, as is always the case with these things. If the letter turns out to mean that there is going to be a genuinely aggressive Israeli strategy of, in El Hayam or whatever, a missile launcher turns up next to a house and it gets destroyed the next day, that could well be different. But I have my doubts. My sense is that once the guns stop, then a kind of process of inertia tends to set in, and that, of course, will benefit Lebanese Hezbollah as it begins the long process of repairing the indeed massive damage that it has suffered over the last 3 months or so.
Right, and I guess how long is really the question here, right? How long will that last? How much time will that buy the Israelis to be able?
That's right. And last time around we got 17 years, right, which is not nothing. It's almost a generation. But as we know, when it ended, it truly ended.
Right. And I think Israel dodged a bullet here in terms of how harsh this war could have been, right? We had heard that, Israel's skies could have been darkened with 3,000 rockets and missiles per day. I think the Israelis made quick work of Hezbollah once they decided to go on the offensive. But that's not necessarily guaranteed next time around. And Hezbollah could seize the initiative next time and flip the script, so to speak, and Israel could be the one reeling. So I think obviously we've got a lot of things to watch out for. But I do want to switch gears for a minute. I want to talk about those Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. I know you've spent a lot of time studying these groups. What should we expect of them moving forward if we actually do achieve a ceasefire in Lebanon? I mean, it was always the case that Hezbollah was leading the Iranian axis of, they call themselves aggressors, I would say, or rather resistance, I would call the axis of aggressors. But they were, I think they sort of seemed to call the tune for everyone else in the region. Do we expect these militias to keep firing occasionally at Israel, the rockets and drones, if and when things go quiet in Lebanon?
First of all, there's an interesting distinction to be drawn here, which I think is one of the more notable and less noted aspects of the events of the last year. And that is that the pro-Iran or Iran-sponsored militias in Syria, I mean, the ones that were created from among Syrians, have been notably silent in the course of the last year. You haven't seen them really getting involved. These are, of course, the weaker clients of Iran, but notably they haven't been particularly noisy. The Iraqi militias, by contrast, of course, have been active, specifically Kataib Hezbollah and Asaib Ahl al-Haq under the notional heading of the Islamic resistance in Iraq. My sense is that for as long as the fighting in Gaza continues, which of course was the original trigger for the entry, the partial and limited entry of the Iraqi Shia militias onto the stage of conflict, for as long as the Gaza fighting continues, the sporadic and partial involvement of the Iraqi Shia militias looks set to continue. I can tell you that perusal of Iraqi media and social media and discussion in recent days tells us that the Iraqi militias are very, very worried at the prospect of major Israeli response in Iraq. I tend to think probably more worried than they need to be, actually, because I don't think that Israel's particularly looking to get involved in that arena where the United States tends to be the one that makes the running on our side, so to speak. But the Iraqi militias are very worried about that. That tells me the sort of symbolic involvement will continue. I don't think that the Iraqi Shia militias will be looking to escalate this, because I think a basic lesson we've learned, and you were hinting at it in your comments a moment ago as well, a basic lesson I think we've learned from the last year is that the Iran-supported regional alliance likes to fight asymmetrical and low-intensity war against Israel. It doesn't like high-intensity conflict because it knows that when things reach a certain level of intensity, its advantages tend to disappear, and Israel's conventional advantage tends to become much more notable and central. So for that reason, I think they'll carry on the sporadic fire, but I don't think there'll be any intensification.
All right, so interesting. So then what about the regime itself in Iran? Will it agree to stand down? And what does that say about the regime's longstanding war against Israel? How do you game out where we are? They're obviously vulnerable right now after losing their air defenses. They're unable to reproduce ballistic missiles right now, which is their I guess that was their advantage in the previous couple of rounds of firing on Israel. So where do you see that one shaking out?
My sense is that, October 7th did not produce what apparently the late Yahya Sinwar hoped it would, which would have been a general all-out mobilization of the Iran-led regional alliance, including Iran, on behalf of Gaza. That didn't happen. What has happened is a kind of partial mobilization to some degree in order for them to be able to say they didn't leave a friend in the lurch, but at the same time, a clear desire to avoid the damage that would accrue from a direct confrontation with Israel. And that's why my prediction was, and up until now at least it has held, that Iran would not carry out the threatened and promised massive retaliation to the last Israeli actions against Iran. In other words, that Iran will be looking to get off the escalation ladder after the last round of Israeli response. We've seen two very large Iranian attacks, of course, on Israel, and those are very significant. And they came, I would remind us, in response to two very significant Israeli acts, the killing of an Iranian Revolutionary Guard general in Damascus and the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So the Iranians, I think, felt they had to respond, but now I think they're keen to get back to the kind of asymmetrical warfare they're keen on. And I'm deeply worried not by the murder of Rabbi Kogan in UAE, not only because of the tragedy inherent in that occurrence, but also because that might mean that the kind of thing the Iranians like to do is now emerging, namely not massive conventional assaults, but rather hitting soft targets, soft Jewish and Israeli targets internationally. We saw that all the way back in the 90s with the destruction of the Amir Community Center in Buenos Aires after the killing of Hezbollah leader Abbas Musawi. We saw that with the Burgas attack in response to the killing of Imad Mughniya in Damascus. That's something which the Iranians do, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're looking to get back to that pattern of activity now, which is kind of the place where they feel comfortable.
Yeah, but of course that would mean that Israel would, I think it would open up the door rather for Israel to respond in a very similar way, getting back to what they called the campaign between the wars, or Mabam, which is more of that asymmetrical work that the Israelis were carrying out either by conventional means or on the ground, cyber, targeted assassinations inside Iran. I mean, that I think the Iranians lose that as well, even if they land a few punches. But let me ask you on just where the IDF is. I mean, there, I think obviously it was a brutal start to this war. Israel looked like it was flat on its back. They seem to be getting back up on their feet right now, obviously taking out Hezbollah the way they have and going after the Iranians the way they have. What's your sense? You speak to Israelis, you live in Israel. What's your sense about where the IDF is in all of this? Are they still kind of bruising for a fight? Or are they ready to take things back down to a dull roar? How do you get a sense? Where's the IDF?
My sense is that the army and the society behind it have, in many ways, performed beyond all expectations in the period, obviously following the chaos of October 7th itself. And I spent, on a number of occasions reported inside Gaza in the course of the last year with a number of different maneuver units, and also up on the northern border. I haven't yet entered Lebanon. I hope that I will manage to do so before the ceasefire comes in. We have to wait and see. But certainly the performance of the army, I think, according to most measures, has been remarkable in terms of the amount of commitment from the younger generation of Israelis, both in regular service and in reserves, and also effective in terms of the cohesion and the results. The enemy has not succeeded. There have not been massive losses among Israeli forces. Every loss is painful, of course, but there have not been massive losses. There have been massive losses on the other side. And the army has managed, the maneuver force has managed to effectively deliver on every mission that it was given, without exception. The army has proven that it can cut through Hamas in Gaza and rearrange affairs on the ground there in the way which is currently now emerging. And the army has proved that it can go against Hezbollah, at least up to what we've currently seen, at least to a depth of between 8 to 10 kilometers in places in southern Lebanon, into places that the army has not touched since 2006, and perform effectively. And so I think, in terms of giving a grade, so to speak, to the IDF in terms of its capacities on the ground, it's good news. The answer is that whatever we may have thought about, the army in the long period of rust, so to speak, and non-activity that took place in the decade and a half since the last war in Lebanon, we can rest assured Israel has an instrument able to project power on the ground in a very, very effective way. And that's become clear in the course of the last year.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a lot to be proud of. I think obviously there's probably a need for a little bit of a breather. It looks
Yes,
like
sure.
they may be getting one. Last question for you before I let you go. You talked about possibly going into Lebanon.
Mhm.
You have a wild story. I remember it from your book, The Transforming Fire. You talked about your experience fighting in the 2006 war against Hezbollah, and then you returned to Lebanon on your British passport. Tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about that story.
Well, that was a year after the war, and yeah, I was very keen on seeing Lebanon again, and actually specifically seeing the areas that we'd fought in 2006, and taking a look at what the process was, specifically of Hezbollah's return and also of the reconstruction of the area. So I managed to get to Beirut with some other friends and colleagues that I think you know, and then I managed to link up with some people who were willing to drive me down to south of the Litani, to really traverse exactly the sectors and areas that myself and comrades have been involved in the course of the war. Tashab and Barun Naras, well, that's not the sector, that's the western sector, but then El Khayam Marjayun, which is where our unit specifically were. And, spend a very interesting day down there, and then a few extra days in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon. And really, didn't discover anything which should have surprised us, but very interesting to see the way in which, and we're talking now about just about a year after the war, a little bit more. It was December of 2007 when I went to make that trip. It was very, very clear that Hezbollah were absolutely in control, on a civilian level at least, south of the Litani, in terms of all the recognizable things that everybody who knows South Lebanon knows: the cars without license plates, the blacked out cars, the young men on motorcycles, all the ways in which Hezbollah maintains its visible presence and its hold on those communities south of the Litani. Was very much there in 2007. I personally witnessed it and then wrote about it when I got back. So it was a fascinating experience, especially a fascinating experience to go to the particular valley beneath El Khayam, where I was involved in myself and friends were involved in some pretty close action in the summer of 2006. So that's something I did back then, and it was certainly a fascinating thing to have done. And my old unit is right now, from what I know, operating around Al Khayam once again. So if I get a chance to go out and hang out with them a little bit, that'll be very interesting too.
All right. Well, wish you luck if you go back. Stay safe. Really crazy story reading about it. And you, of course, saw some fairly harrowing action, if I recall. Hezbollah taking out tanks in front of you and behind you. At any rate, stay safe. And we'll be watching that ceasefire in the north. Thank you, Jonathan Spire, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Much thanks, John.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Annie Fixler and Joe Yang of FDD Cyber Center have a compelling piece in the Cipher Brief highlighting the urgent need for a plan to protect America's railroads from cyber attack. This comes on the heels of a newly proposed TSA cybersecurity rule that mandates the establishment of cyber risk management programs for both pipelines and railroads, building on previous security directives. While this is an important and positive development, successful implementation in the rail sector will require ongoing collaboration between federal agencies and private industry stakeholders. My colleague Ben Cohen's column in JNS highlights a troubling shift by Amsterdam's mayor in response to the recent violence against Israeli soccer fans. After initially acknowledging the severity of the attack, the mayor quickly reversed course, downplaying its significance. This abrupt change exposes a broader problem: the European tendency to minimize or deny the reality of anti-Semitism, thereby enabling its persistence. Finally, my colleague Mark Montgomery contributed a key chapter to a new report from the Vandenberg Coalition and the McCain Institute titled A Conservative Strategy for Countering Russia. Monty predicts that the incoming administration will confront a far more complex and dangerous threat landscape than the Biden administration faced, with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea posing an increasingly coordinated threat to global stability. Monty emphasizes that strengthening U.S. military capabilities and that of our allies should be a top priority for the next administration. That is going to do it for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels, and please do support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another riveting episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We'll be featuring Bruce Hoffman, a top expert on terrorism who's based at Georgetown University. Nobody does the terrorism study better than Bruce, a gentleman and a scholar. really knows his stuff in this field. I'm thrilled he's agreed to appear on the show. So please do tune in. And until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.